Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are around the world. My name is Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And I am so excited. I'm honestly really pumped for the biggest competitive event that we are going to see in this season in the World Championship 30. We have done basically this kind of coverage for every Pro Tour that has taken place, gradually getting bigger and bigger, and why not go as much as we can into the World Championship. So just like we've done with all Pro Tours, I'm going to kind of give you some of the information, the rundown that we have currently as it stands, how you can watch the event, some of the storylines, who's going to be casting it, and giving, of course, some thoughts and predictions to, make it a little bit more fun for trying to figure out what the heck is going to happen at World Championship 30. And I expect every single player that has qualified for this event, whether they have top 8 at a Pro Tour, whether they have won a regional championship, anything of that nature, we're going to see all that hard work kind of pay off and watch these players battle it out on one of the biggest competitive stages that we have in Magic the Gathering currently. But of course, before we get into anything from World Championship 30, I will try to keep this as brief as possible. But if you enjoy what you're seeing at any point in the video and you want to support my channel, the easiest way to do that is to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. And of course, going in the description down below, I have a link to my Discord server as well. If you want to go ahead and join over there, you can follow that link and join. Follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is in the description down below. And finally, shout out to the sponsor of the channel in ManaTraders, where it's a subscription-based service where with my link, you can go and sign up for their subscription service to rent cards on Magic the Gathering Online and play any of the decks that we feature on this channel, and even compete in their monthly tournament where it's a free entry. You just have to qualify for the Swiss rounds. Even sometimes they don't even have the qualifier rounds. They end up just having the Swiss, and all you have to do is submit a deck list and then get ready to roll on this 2-day tournament. So if you want to save a little bit of money on your subscription service, want to support the channel, go ahead and follow that link in the description down below, and you'll save 5% off your monthly subscription through ManaTraders. I want to thank ManaTraders again for sponsoring the channel. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the information that we have for World Championship 30. So here we are, the World Championship Viewer's Guide, written by Rich Hagan. If any of these articles interest you and you want to kind of read more in depth to them, go ahead. You can follow the link in the description I'll have down below there for any of the articles that you see here. And of course, you can click on your own links and stuff like that within them, because we have the full invitational list available here. There's 115 players currently enrolled for the World Championship 30, and it's going to be really, really exciting here. So of course, coverage is going to start from Las Vegas. One of the big things that we have to kind of look forward to is actually the start time, where Modern Horizons 3, I'll admit, kind of sucked when I was trying to, cover as much of the event as I could and then try to get a video out that same day, kind of covering what happened, the metagame, and things like that. We have a 2 p.m. start time on the East Coast, which believes that's like 11 a.m. on like the West Coast, and then of course they have the other adjusted times here. But day 1 of the event is going to start on Friday, October 25th. It's going to be Duskmourn, House of Horror, Draft, and Standard, which I believe there's only going to be 7 rounds between day 1 and then 7 rounds on day 2. So we'll have 3 rounds of Duskmourn Draft and then 4 rounds of Standard, followed by on the next day, Saturday, October 26th, 3 rounds of Duskmourn, House of Horror, Draft, and 4 rounds of Standard. And then from all of that, we are going to concoct our top 8, which is only going to be what's going to happen on Sunday. We're going to be able to see all the quarterfinal, semifinal, and of course the finals with a top 8 single elimination best of 5. So all this is going to be happening on twitch.tv/magic. So this is where they essentially have the, the weekly Magic streams, things like that. If you're already following the channel, subscribe to it, whatever, then you should get the notification of when they actually go live. So I actually read somewhere that the broadcast is actually going to start later, which I believe it says here. We'll start at 2 p.m. with 3 rounds of Duskmourn Draft by 4 rounds constructed. Sunday is the same thing, where they will stream all 4 quarterfinal matches and the semifinals. While competitors begin their Friday and Saturday early on site at MagicCon Las Vegas, broadcast begins later in the day at 8 p.m. CEST or 2 p.m. Eastern Time, which is on the East Coast, with a featured drafter to follow into their round 1 gameplay. As we continue the broadcast, we'll catch up to the tournament, showing a full feature match from every round and reducing downtime until we're pacing live gameplay on a short delay. So this is, I don't know if this is actually anything particularly new. It's not something that I necessarily noticed in any of the other coverage, and maybe I probably should have. Some of the early mornings from MH3 just kind of all run together since I don't sleep at night anyway. But this is actually really interesting. I think that this is, I guess from a pure standpoint, I have a little bit of a problem with, because I'm like, I want to watch it live all the time. I have, some very fond memories of, just kicking it back to the news desk, talking about some of the other stuff going on with the tournament, maybe some other announcements. But I think overall, for a viewer's perspective, that this is overall a good thing. I believe that the event starts at like 9 o'clock, or, the first draft, or I guess the drafting starts at like 9:05 a.m., I believe, on the West Coast. So I believe then we're only at like 2, maybe like starting round 3 by the time we see, the featured drafter, and then going into kind of those rounds. So I would imagine probably by the end of the day, we would be caught up. I would say maybe like by the second to last round, there would be kind of a little bit less of a delay, or I guess rather, that few minute delay that they're talking about in there. But I think overall, from a viewer's perspective, this is going to be a pretty good thing. I think that, with less kind of downtime in between, you're just kind of going match after match after match after match. This does kind of break my brain a little bit, because I am basically like tuned into watching matches of Magic at like 2 times speed, thanks to YouTube. So I definitely, knowing that like the tournament is in like round 5 or round 6, I would almost want to like 2 times speed from like round 1 up until we get to wherever they're at, to kind of watch like the live Magic and stuff. But again, longer than it probably needs to be said. I think this is a good thing for maybe the casual watchers of the event, and less so the like Magic purists, if you will. So what's at stake in the World Championship? There's more than World Championship up to grab, as enticing may be. The dazzling season-long battle for supremacy concludes with the 8 remaining players into the ring to go toe-to-toe, friend and foe alike. Their prize, Player of the Year, a moment to cherish, and claiming the Kai Buddha Player of the Year trophy, which at Modern Horizons 3, they actually changed the Player of the Year trophy to the Kai Buddha Player of the Year award. Shout out to him, probably one of, if not the greatest Magic player of all time currently. So this is a big thing. We have a lot of, a few players, 8 to be exact, that are going to be fighting for that title. On top of course, us crowning a world champion, the big $100,000 prize, and the, their likeness put onto a Magic the Gathering card, which we saw with Nathan Stoyer winning the last world championship and being printed on a card that was released in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which the name escapes me currently, which should be not a surprise to anybody at all. So here we have some of the World Championship competitors that are going to be fighting for that top spot, and winning the Player of the Year race. So probably is not as a surprise to anybody. Simon Nielsen is the number 1 player, because if he can get to the semifinals of the event, he doesn't even have to win Worlds. He just has to make the top 8, win his quarterfinal match. He has locked up Player of the Year. No matter what else happens, Seth Banfield, Jason Yee could win the event, and Simon has it all locked up, and he will be, I believe this will make him like back-to-back Player of the Year, if I'm not mistaken, because he had like 3 top 8 appearances last year, on top of, winning or getting to the finals of Pro Tour Mirza Karlov Manor, losing to Seth Manfield in that finals. Top 32 Pro Tour Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which is, essentially like a down tournament, just making top 32 of, one of the 3 hardest tournaments, or I guess one of the 4 hardest tournaments you can play of the year. And of course, winning Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3, aka Nadu Horizons 3. So it's a great year. 5 top 8s in like his last 6 premier events is absolutely an insane dominant run. Unfortunately, only 1 win to kind of show for it, but that just kind of goes to show you that that's the disappointment in this. He only won 1 after top 5, top 8ing 5 of his last 6, and a top 32 nonetheless is still something that I would imagine like the 0.1% of Magic players can understand, while the other 99.9 are just going to be kind of hoping that they can even qualify for the Pro Tour. Of course, in talking about how great Simon has been over not just this year, but in the last 2 years, we also have some other players that have been playing it very well, of course. So basically, Seth Manfield, Jason Yee, Javier Dominguez, Sam Party, Eli Cassis, Sean Goddard, and Yuta Takahashi are the players that could, in theory, things go the right way, they can take over. I believe as Seth Manfield ends up, I think if Seth Manfield wins and Simon Nielsen doesn't even top 8, or maybe if like Simon Nielsen top 8s but gets knocked out in the quarters, then Seth Manfield winning the event, I believe, becomes the player of the year, which is absolutely stunning to me. That, we've had Seth Manfield, won Pro Tour Merge Zakharov Manor, made the top 8, got knocked out in the quarterfinals of Modern Horizons 3. I'm not exactly sure how well he did at the Pro Tour Outlaws of Thunder Junction, but the fact that Seth has, won a Pro Tour and has made the top 8 with another one, and then, of course, we have Simon runner-up in the first Pro Tour of the year, and then winning the last Pro Tour of the year, with a top 32 finish in between. These players are pretty close in terms of points for this award. So, Seth Manfield probably having the best chance. Jason Yee as well, also having a very good chance. If Seth Manfield and Simon Nielsen, probably the solid 1-2 for the whole year, just decide that they're going to have a bad tournament, or maybe not necessarily a bad tournament, but just don't play as well as they can, miss out on maybe like a top 16 or even a top 8, it definitely opens the door for Jason Yee to come in and actually win the award. Of course, we can say the same thing, for a bunch of other things. A lot of these players are just hoping that the players in front of them don't make the top 8, probably don't even have a very particularly good tournament, and then they come in and win worlds. Any of these players can win, which is insane. We have, Javier Dominguez is a former world champion. Seth Manfield is a former world champion. Sam Pardee is not a former world champion, but a very decorated player nonetheless. Jason Yee has been dominating tournaments. Back-to-back top 8s to kind of put themselves in the conversation for player of the year is pretty amazing. Sean Goddard, top 8ing Pro Tour Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which weird. I don't know why they just call it OTJ, but whatever. There's a lot of really good players here that have done very well throughout the season. Of course, we can point to Simon Nielsen as being like the best player up to this point, but it's not the award for the best player up until Worlds. It's the best player of the year and who has performed at the highest level as consistently as anybody else. And if I were a betting man, my money would be on Simon Nielsen to be the player of the year by the end of it. I think that, get rid of the fact that they're in first place right now. I think that Simon is just by far and away has been like the best player in probably the last like few years. So I think, to see them win the award would be amazing, especially when I believe it will be back-to-back player of the year finishes, and especially you can top it off with like a World's victory. You can look at someone in like the past like 12 months and say that they have 2 player of the year awards, have won a Pro Tour and won a World Championship. It is just an insanely dominant run from probably one of the most dominant players that we've seen over the last few years. Moving on from that, we will get the deck list published. They'll be published Friday, June 28th at the beginning of round 4 gameplay. So the Duskmourn draft decks will not be published, but we'll definitely cover the deck list from certain players depending on who's doing well when we get when we conclude the first day of competition. On that day, it says June 28th. I don't know why it says June 28th, but it's going to be October 26th, I believe, is the Friday of that event. Or I guess the 25th. I'm not sure. Like their dates are kind of weird, and like this could easily be fixed, and we wouldn't be worrying about it. But we will definitely go over the deck list. We're going to be going over the metagame share because I believe on Thursday we'll kind of get a post, or at least a graphic kind of showing off like the potential metagame share of what decks players decide to register for this event. And of course, the broadcast team, I think one of the most important things, I think you can have a lot of great things going on kind of in front of you that you can tangibly watch, but I also think it's a very good broadcast team to kind of help like heighten the emotions that you're feeling, the suspense, the happiness, the soul crushing something where you see your favorite player just like all of a sudden lose to like a top deck, something like that. And we see Maria Bertoldi, we see Cedric Phillips, Monty DeFuti, Marshall Sutcliffe, Paul Cheon back in the booth, Ailey and Corey Baumeister being on the broadcast team. This lineup is amazing. You know, this has just been the bread and butter, like tried and true, like one of the best like broadcast teams that we have seen. You know, Cedric, awesome as always. Maria at the desk, always awesome. Monty, you know, just great synergy among all of the casters and stuff here. I'm glad to see Paul Chion back in the booth. You know, I'm going to be super excited, you know, to see his insight on the Duskmorn part of this, because he is a very, very good drafter and very entertaining to watch, as well as a content creator. And then of course, what do players have to win? And I said that kind of in the beginning, where competitors that finish in the top 8 receive invitations for each Pro Tour and the World Championship 31 taking place in the 2024-2025 season. So we know that it's MagicCon Chicago, MagicCon Las Vegas, and I believe MagicCon Atlanta are the current Pro Tour locations. We don't know where World Championship 31 is going to take place. I would assume probably going back to Vegas, unless, you know, we're going to get the well, I guess I think it's in Vegas, but if we get the Sphere, that'd be pretty sweet. Probably not going to happen, but would be really cool. But the top 8 finishers for the World Championship 30 will get all those invites. All players will compete for their share of $1 million in prizes, with the world champion winning $100,000 and $4,000 going to, you know, basically anybody, as long as they, regardless of their final placing. So you could be in last place, you're still winning $4,000. Not too bad for, you know, going and competing well at one of the game's highest stages. Someone has to get last, but $4,000 probably makes the tiers a little bit more, maybe not enjoyable, but you know what I mean. It's easy to wipe your tears away with a $100 bill. But yeah, that's kind of the viewer's guide for this. Definitely some things to keep in mind too. The Player of the Year race is seems like it's kind of secondary to the World Championship, which obviously, you know, players are going to care probably more about the person winning directly in front of them, unless it's something like Simon Nielsen or Seth Manfield, Jason Yee, Javier Dominguez, one of those 8 players winning, and then, you know, it'll end up getting brought up on the broadcast. I would expect that the broadcast booth would be talking about, you know, the Player of the Year race, and trying to keep people in the loop as we also look at some of the standings for the event as well. But, you know, that's the watch guide for the event. Again, this will be linked in the description down below if you want to kind of reference this information. And now let's go ahead and take a look at, you know, what the metagame kind of looks like right now going into the event. This is not the metagame currently for the event, but this is kind of an idea of what some of the most played decks and kind of what people are doing in the format currently, to kind of get an understanding of what to expect when, I believe on Thursday, we will end up getting that metagame breakdown from Frank Karsten. So here I'm going to throw up a screenshot of the metagame that I'm currently going to be looking at via MTG Goldfish, where we're going to be looking at the top 10 decks. We're not going to look at all 10 decks in this video. I have like the first 5, where I think that these are the most likely decks that we're going to see at the event, at least in the greatest numbers here. So I have Gruul Prowess being the first deck. It's very easy to start with. It's considered the best deck in the format. It seems like it's being played more than any other deck in the format, and the data kind of suggests that. And this deck list here ended up getting 3rd in one of these standard challenges just a day after recording this video. So the basic premise of the Gruul Prowess deck is, you know, drawing the right mix of creatures and spells to be able to kind of push through 20 points of damage to kill your opponent. So a lot of things that a lot of these decks kind of share across each other through all the different variants of Gruul is a lot of the creatures being played. So like Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger being some of the new cards from the from Bloomburrow, and Manifold Mouse to kind of repeat on, you know, these targeting effects, so you can trigger your Heartfire Hero to get +1/+1 counters on it, and to get a little bit of card advantage from your Emberheart Challenger. On top of that, Manifold Mouse giving those creatures double strike or trample until end of turn, and then being a very good mana sink later on, where you can just make, you know, essentially a copy of Manifold Mouse and then give a mouse you control double strike and trample if you need to, is just a really nice thing to have. You don't necessarily need this, because like on turn 2 when you play it and you follow, you know, you have a Heartfire Hero on 1, Manifold Mouse on 2, you're attacking with a 2/2 double strike on turn 2. Into turn 3, you can use the Manifold Mouse again, target this, it becomes a 3/3, give a double strike, and of course, probably the best pump spell that we've seen in a while in Monstrous Rage, just ends up giving it trample and makes it like a 6 power, you know, essentially a 6/4 attacking creature that your opponent, for one, isn't going to beat in combat and is just going to be able to pile on a ton of damage before factoring in really anything else here. So this deck in particular, I think, has been very good. I definitely like the version not playing Leyline of Resonance over, the versions that do, simply for the fact that I think Innkeeper's Talent is enough of a card where it's going to allow you to repeatedly trigger your Emberheart Challenger and your Heartfire Hero. It's going to make cards like Screaming Nemesis, Monastery Swift Spear, Manifold Mouse a lot harder to deal with. It essentially just makes all of your creatures threats, and then once you level it up, permanents you control with counters on them have Ward 1. Ward 1 is very annoying when your opponent's trying to kind of tap out every turn and you're kind of disrupting that, where they're only going to be able to play maybe one, and then eventually when they get to a later part of the game, 2 spells, but you're already hitting for tons of damage. Once you get your opponent down to 1, 2, 3 life, you do have Shock and Lightning Strike to kind of close out those games. So Innkeeper's Talent definitely being a pretty big help. Another card that you sometimes see in the main of these decks is Questing Druid. This is like another way that the deck can play a little bit grindier of a game, where you can just end step, Seek the Beast, untap. You have those 2 cards available to you, plus your draw step. You're going to be able to more than likely find your 3rd land. You're going to be able to play Questing Druid, maybe play another spell, get a counter on the Questing Druid, and then just kind of take over from there. It's definitely a card that allows you to play a lot grindier, where in the case of, the Leyline version, where, you have 4 Cacophony Scamp, you have 4 Leyline, playing more pump spells, there's definitely a chance to be blown out more by the removal spells of the format. So the kind of, we're going to play Innkeeper's Talent and, some of these other, Lightning Strike, Shocks, and, have some of the good pump spells, but, we're going to be able to use them a little bit more effectively, and then kind of rely on the creatures a little bit more is definitely a nice thing to do. Might of the Meek is going to give a creature trample no matter what. It'll get +1/+0 until end of turn if you control a mouse. So it does not have to target a mouse to get the +1/+0. So in a lot of cases, it's just going to be something that allows you to draw a card and give one of your creatures trample, more than likely a mouse, because then your Manifold Mouse is going to be able to give double strike. You're going to be able to target Heartfire Hero with the Might of the Meek, give it trample and +1/+0, and then it's just going to be able to pile on tons of damage. And that's just the name of the game of the Gruul Prowess deck. It's super fast, it's very efficient in what it does, and when you're playing the Leyline version, you can basically just kind of high roll people, and then also, even sometimes playing through like removal spells, if you play it very smart, your opponent goes to destroy your Cacophony Scamp, and then all of a sudden you have, cast 2 turn inside outs, become 4 turn inside outs. Your opponent ends up taking 3, 6, 9, 12, 13 damage, and then you have 4 creatures that are more than likely going to be lethal on your next turn, especially if you can flip any of them and then cast another spell. Just absolutely gross stuff that the Leyline version can do. I just think that the version that I think players are going to kind of gravitate more is this more consistent version, where you're not going to get necessarily blown out by playing removal spells or maybe missing land drops or whatever the case may be. I think that players are going to go for the more of the safety net that is the Innkeeper version of Gruul Prowess rather than the Leyline version. And with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our second most played deck in the current standard metagame. So here next we have Golgari Midrange. This is a deck that has had kind of 2 different styles that you could kind of play towards, sort of kind of like the Gruul aggro deck, where it had this combo essentially. I'm going to say infinite combo because that's not even close to what it is, but it had a combo where if you had a fully upgraded Innkeeper's Talent plus a Vraska completed or something like that, you could double the amount of counters that you're going to put on somebody, and Vraska essentially gets them to all but 1 poison. So if they had 0 poison, she gives them 9 counters. If they have 5, then she gives them 4, whatever the case may be. But with the interaction with Innkeeper's Talent, that kind of combo, essentially she would come in with enough loyalty counters to ultimate, meaning then she could put your opponent to 9 poison if they didn't have any, and then you double those counters, meaning 18, which means you accidentally win the game. This is not what these mid-range decks look like, and I think that going forward, I think if there is going to be more of a Golgari deck with that combo or Gruul with the Leyline combo, chances are we'd see more probably of the Leyline. I think that's just so explosive, and the upside on it is like insane, especially if your opponent stumbles at any point. But nonetheless, I think Golgari midrange is probably a bit better of a deck without that sort of combo in it. So kind of what we see here, Mosswood Dread Knight has been kind of a staple of these like green-black midrange decks for a while now, since it's been in Standard. Glissa Sunslayer has been a very good creature. I mean, 3/3 first strike death touch is just super hard to play defense against, and then a hard creature to want to block with anything meaningful, especially with kind of the nature of these mid-range decks where they just have a lot of the efficient removal, a lot of good efficient creatures that are going to give you a ton of value the longer the game goes on. And Glissa, of course, is going to be able to do that by getting to draw you some extra cards, destroy an enchantment, and get rid of remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So you're going to be able to kind of shrink some other creatures, but most of the time, this is just going to be drawing extra cards and potentially blowing up problematic enchantments, sort of kind of like the Innkeeper's Talents and stuff that we see going on. Tranquil Throwback, being a 3-mana 3/3 that you can pay green up to 3 times, and then you can choose up to however many modes. Being a naturalize for a creature or an artifact or enchantment, you end up getting to exile target player's graveyard, gain 4 life, and the fact that it is a pretty decent sized creature for 3 mana as well gives you something to sink your mana into. Sheoldred of the Apocalypse, the card that has been probably actually seeing a decline in play, I would say, across all formats, but for a while this was I think perceived as one of the weakest of the Praetors, maybe a little bit better than the red one in Urbrask, but ends up being probably one of the best ones to be playing and saw the most play across the 3 major formats. And we see it in 3 copies here. Harvester of Misery is a fairly aggressive creature. This also just has like a mode where you can discard it, give a creature -2/-2. Has a little bit of synergy with Virtue of Persistence. If you actually get to play this Virtue, you can put the creature from your graveyard onto the battlefield, and you'll get its ETB trigger to give all the other creatures -2/-2 until end of turn to potentially wrath the board of some of the other small creature like aggro decks. We see Liliana the Veil starting to creep up and see a little bit more play, and a lot of these spells, we see like Gix's Command is like a good board wipe. You need to put counter up 2 +1/+1 counters up to 1 creature, and then gaining lifelink until end of turn, getting to wrath the board. You end up giving Harvester of Misery, Glissa, any of these creatures some counters, give it lifelink. You're going to basically swing the race in your favor for the most part. You can also use this to buy 2 creatures from your graveyard and put them into your hand, giving you a little bit of sort of kind of like card advantage in that sense. This deals with big creatures, it deals with a lot of small creatures. Just it's a very versatile card and a very good card for the Standard format. We see Terror Sunder is essentially a disenchant, but then if you kick it, it gets you can exile target non-land permanent instead. So it's another thing that you can kind of sink your mana into, and ends up having a little bit more utility for the late game, where it's not just destroying an artifact or enchantment. It's going to be able to hit just about anything. Pillage the Bog has been a card that's kind of floated as being this kind of good, like essentially like Demonic Tutor-esque, where if you have enough lands in play, you're essentially going to be able to look for whatever card you want. And even in the early portions of the game where you plot this on like turn 3 and like turn 4, you end up playing your 4th land, maybe you're looking for a Sheoldred, you're going to have a draw step plus looking 8 cards deep with a Pillage the Bog. So as a 1-of is totally fine. Go for the Throw. It's been one of the most efficient removal spells in the format. Anoint with Affliction, exile a creature if it's mana value 3 or less. I think it has a lot to do with the Gruul aggro deck. Of course, the creatures in it want to die. They want to go to the graveyard so they can shoot you or shoot your opponent for tons of damage. And Anoint the Affliction is a card that is going to deal with those creatures in the early game. And I don't think there's a really way to get other poison counters on this. Maybe if you have something, and I don't actually see it in the mana base here, but you're never really going to get to that corrupted part of it. But definitely getting rid of things mana value 3 or less is going to be good enough for Anoint with Affliction to actually be very valuable. Analyze the Pollen as well, being a spell that you can collect Evidence 8, so you exile total mana value 8 or greater from your graveyard. You can search for a basic land, that's totally fine. If Evidence is collected, you search for a creature or land card, and then you put that into your hand. You can go and get your one of Harvester of Misery, your Tranquil Throwback, your Glissas, or Mosswood Dread Knight to kind of get some card advantage going. Or you can go get like your Restless Cottage or Demolition Field if need be, to deal either with the problematic creature lands or just getting your own creature land to kind of close out some games. This is definitely a deck that can go pretty big. I kind of like this build of this deck in particular. I think it has a lot of good, efficient removal options. It's got a lot of good creatures in the deck. Glissa being a hard creature to kind of deal with you know, especially in combat, you are going to have to use a removal spell for it. And there's just some other creatures that I think on rate, kind of like as they sit on the battlefield, end up being a lot better than something like a Glissa Sunslayer. Some pretty powerful cards on the sideboard as well. Nissa, Ascended Animus. The Cruelty of Gix is essentially like a removal, or not really a removal spell, but you know, you can end up getting like a discard out of it. You can search your library for a card. You'll end up losing 3 life for that. And then putting a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, so you can do it from either player's graveyard. Ends up being still, I would say, very powerful, and you have the ability to read ahead, so you can choose essentially what chapter you start on, you know, whether you want to go all the way to the last one, or if you want to go tutor and then go get a creature back. Works all the same. Another Gis's command, more Harvester of Miseries. Aclazotz has been a card that has been pretty impressive, you know, getting to rip cards out of your opponent's hand, Duress, Terrace Hunter, and 2 more Liliana of the Veils. This is kind of a deck that I like the Gruul aggro deck personally. I think a lot of what we're going to see is kind of these, you know, mid-range decks versus the super aggressive aggro decks. And I think Golgari midrange is a very good representative of it. I do particularly like Golgari midrange for the fact that, for me personally, that's just my favorite color combination to play, you know, in these mid-range style decks. But I think there's a lot of really powerful things going on here, where I think if you can deal with an early like Cacophony scam from certain versions of the mono red, or, you know, from the Gruul aggro deck to the Heartfire Heroes and things like that, I think from there you can kind of beat some of the other creatures in combat. And Glissa just also being super annoying, unless, you know, even if you give those creatures double strike, you're still going to deal first strike damage to Glissa and get rid of that creature and essentially, you know, negate the double damage that they would end up doing. So while those are probably my 2 front runners for, you know, the most played decks in the format, there are some other decks that are pretty sweet, and I'm actually kind of interested to look into our next deck here. Behold, we have Azorius Tempo. This deck is insanely annoying to play against, and I've played it quite a bit on the arena ladder here. So you're essentially kind of built around Abhorrent Oculus and Hoti Jin, which Abhorrent Oculus has been absolutely insane. 3 mana 5/5 is additional cost to cast. You exile 6 cards from your graveyard. More than likely, you're never paying that cost. It has flying. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you manifest Dread, meaning you look at the top 2 cards of your library, you put one in the graveyard, you put the other one in the battlefield face down as a 2/2, and then as a sorcerer, I believe you can pay its cost to then turn it face up. It doesn't have to be a sorcery. A lot of the times, like Abhorrent Oculus and even the Jin, where its power and toughness is equal to the number of instant sorcery cards in your graveyard, and instant sorcery spells you control cost 1 less to cast. Great, wonderful. It's a 3 mana star 4 flying creature, just very annoying, has the potential to deal a ton of damage here. In these 2 cards, while you can cast Jin, and of course you can cast the Abhorrent Oculus, it's not totally out of the realm of possibility. This deck does have a little bit of consistency, if you will, thanks to the cards Helping Hand and Recommission. So Helping Hand, for 1 white, you return target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and then Recommission returns an artifact or a creature from the graveyard with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and if its creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So between these 2 cards, you have essentially 6 ways of returning these creatures, while you can play the Jin on turn 3 and then just have it kind of sit on the battlefield. And if your opponent ends up dealing with it, well, then you have, you know, cards like Helping Hand to get it back, comes to play tapped. Who cares? And then you have this kind of cost reduction for cards like Phantom Interference, where you can essentially spend 1 mana to counter a target spell unless it pays 2, and then, you know, or 4 mana total to end up actually just making a 2/2 and countering a spell, things of that nature. You see Charter Course, Moment of Truth. These are being cards that give you a lot of card advantage. Charter Course, you attack with a Jin or an Abhorrent Oculus, or even a manifested card with it. You're going to be able to Charter Course for 1 mana, draw 2 cards, and then you won't have to discard a card since you attack with a creature this turn. And Moment of Truth, getting to look at the top 3 cards, getting to be very Expressive Iteration-esque like, where you put one of those cards in your hand, you put one into the graveyard and the other one in the bottom of your library. So while you definitely don't get as much card advantage in a deck like this, where you kind of want some of these cards in your graveyard, Moment of Truth is going to kind of give you that. So really nice there. Soul Partition is like a weird card where you can exile a target non-land permanent, and for as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it. And if a spell cast by an opponent this way costs 2 more to cast. So if you target your opponent's Heartfire Hero, it's going to cost 3 total mana to replay it. But for Soul Partition, you can actually target one of your own things. So you could target an Abhorrent Oculus, you can target a Picklock Prankster, or a Haughty Jin, and you'll be able to cast it for its cost, since the tax on that cost only matters if your opponent is casting the spell. So something very interesting there to kind of keep in mind when you if you decide to play this deck, that you can target your own things and get some value that way. The mana base also being pretty simple here: 4 Attic Carways, Flood Farm, Verge, 4 Meticulous Archive, 4 Coast, 4 islands, 1 plains to kind of wrap things up. And the sideboard, you just get to play some more reactive things. Monastery Mentor is a pretty good target to kind of get back. Temporary Lockdown is pretty good against the super aggressive, Gruul decks. 4 Negate, 2 Get Lost. This is something that used to be played in the deck, and you'll probably still see some play in the deck, but has kind of moved away again with the fact that some of the Gruul aggro decks want their creatures to die so they can deal damage to you. Into the Flood Maw, to go up to the full play set. Bounce a creature. You can give your opponent a fish to bounce an on-land permanent they control. Elspeth Smite as well, dealing 3 damage target, attacking or blocking creature. If a creature would die this turn, you exile it instead. And this is the kind of way that you can get around the dice triggers of some of the Gruul aggro decks. And this deck is very annoying to play against because, you get to the board early. They have a lot of good early interaction for what the aggro decks are trying to do. And then the Jin is just going to be able to close out games very quickly, along with the Abhorrent Oculus as well, just being able to make a 2/2 every other turn and feed into this game plan where if you end up finding a Helping Hand or a Recommission, you're going to be able to get back more Jins, maybe more Abhorrent Oculuses because they're not legendary. So if you have multiple of these in play, then you're just going to make multiple 2/2s and just kind of have them be on chump blocking duty. Also have the Oculuses hitting your opponent and creating more copies, or essentially more 2/2s. Just makes it very hard for your opponent to kind of beat through your team, especially when you have 2 Oculuses going. Maybe a potential dark horse of the format. Yet remains to be seen. It's not necessarily the dark horse that I would pick for this event. I believe that's the next deck and the last deck that we're actually going to look at. But nonetheless, this is a deck to not kind of be. It's not a deck to underestimate. The fact that these creatures can just be kind of played on curve. Abhorrent Oculus, maybe not so much. There is some potential there, but a lot of the time you are just going to be trying to get this back, and then eventually maybe later in the game you're going to be able to cast these from your hand. But by and large, you're going to be looking at more or less trying to get these back from the graveyard, and of course trying to play some of these other like reactive spells to make sure that you don't die, and then you kind of get to the point where 1 or 2 attacks is going to close out the game. But that's the Azorius tempo deck. Let's go ahead and take a look at our last deck that we're going to take a look at before we kind of get into some predictions of the format. Lastly, we have Domain, everybody's favorite archetype for however long, because we just cannot get rid of this card Leyline Binding. So the Domain deck ended up actually winning one of the Pro Tours, I believe, this year. I think it was Outlaws of Thunder Junction, where it beat Blue-White Control in the finals. And Domain has been a very powerful archetype, really, in Standard and Pioneer, but it was definitely expected to fall off once we kind of, move past having some of the triomes and that. And really hasn't missed a beat. It's been a very solid deck, and especially with some new additions from the Duskmourn set, the Domain deck is kind of poised to kind of reprise its role as one of the better decks, or one of the best choices in the current Standard format. And while I think the deck hasn't necessarily performed all that well, I also think that in the hands of some high-level players, we could see like Domain end up being like one of the top 3 decks currently in the format. So with some of the other tools we talk about, of course, Overlord of the Hauntwoods, I think, is the biggest addition for this deck. Playing a turn 2 up the Beanstalk and following up with an Overlord of the Hauntwoods with Impending, you are going to be able to get that trigger from the up the Beanstalk, and then you're going to be able to create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type. So you're going to fulfill all the requirements for Domain, and you're going to have a land that can essentially tap for any color. That is going to help you color fix for your Atraxa Grand Unifier. It's also going to make your Leyline Bindings cost 1 mana, all the important things so you can get as much value as you can, especially from cards like Up the Beanstalk. Temporary Lockdown, while sort of kind of a non-bow in the deck because it does get rid of your Beanstalks, it doesn't really hit anything else. And in a moment where you're getting rid of your Beanstalks, you have other ways to kind of get out from underneath of this. You can end up sunfalling your own enchantment, so then you can make some map tokens, whatever. You get your Beanstalks back, and then you end up getting those triggers. Sunfall has been like the go-to board wipe for the format. It ends up making a fairly big creature. It exiles all the creatures instead of destroying them. Again, getting around those dice triggers. Elspeth Smite, another removal option that we kind of looked at from the blue-white tempo deck, where it's going to deal 3 damage to a target attacking or blocking creature, and if it would die, it gets exiled. Again, another thing getting around the death triggers that we want to see, or rather our opponents want to see from their cards. Overlord of the Hauntwoods is the only Overlord we're looking at. We have Overlord of the Mistmoors, which creates 2/2/1 flying or white insect creature tokens with flying. So this is going to ideally, again, when you impend it, you can go and get triggers from up the beanstalk, and then you can end up making some 2/1 flyers. You know, when this comes into play, it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility of just being able to hardcast this pretty early in the game to just, you know, get in there and hit your opponent for tons of damage and put a very, very, very quick clock on them. I don't know if a lot of these decks would maybe shift more towards the Overlord of the Boiler Works or something like that. But nonetheless, you know, the Overlord that makes flyers and the one that makes lands is a pretty good option. Biza the Bounding Spring with the plethora of aggro decks in the format means that you can a lot of the time end up gaining some life and then making some fish tokens as well. Potentially even drawing some cards as well. More than likely not, but and Biza really isn't probably going to make treasure tokens either, but getting 4 life, making 2/1/1s, forcing your opponent to basically give their creatures trample to kind of beat over your things is going to be pretty tough for them to do, you know, the 3rd or 4th time around when your efficient removal spells are going to be able to kind of get the job done in an ideal world. So definitely a lot of things kind of going on with this deck. I would say this is pretty bare bones. We're used to kind of seeing Yorion in sort of these kind of lists, so it's kind of weird seeing like up the beanstalk and then there also being 60 cards in this deck. But you have 26 lands. You're going to have no problem hitting your land drops. You kind of want to get to the point where you hit your 3rd land drop on turn 3, and especially having double green, so you can play Overlord of the Hauntwoods, kind of get your lands going, and then get your mana base going as well, because Overlord's going to be able to set up for a turn 3 Sunfall, which is actually going to avoid Overlord of the Mistmoors and the Hauntwoods when they're on their kind of impending journey to enter the battlefield, because then you just sweep away the board, you get rid of your opponent's creatures, you end up getting a big creature sitting on the board, then boom, they come off impending, you know, a turn or 2 later, and you just have these big creatures on top of like a giant token that you made with Sunfall. This is a deck that I would kind of expect to see I would think to be kind of like a counter meta pick. And I think that this is pretty hostile, as hostile as you can kind of get for these aggro decks. I think if players are kind of expecting, you know, these aggro decks to kind of come out, then, you know, I would expect to see more of the domain decks kind of seeing play and being registered. I think Atraxa is just, you know, a very, very tough creature to kind of deal with. You can definitely get got by some of the tools that the Golgari decks have, maybe in the post-board games. But mainly, like, this is going to be one of your best creatures to put into play. Overlord of the Mistmoors and Overlord of the Hauntwoods is going to be pretty sweet. Just overall, you know, I really like what this deck has going on. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, we could see this being, like, in the top 3. Certainly in the top 5 archetypes of the format. But it has the potential to creep in at that 3rd spot, even though I think it's solidly held down by, like, the Gruul and the Golgari decks. But that's our kind of look at the metagame. English is starting to get very hard for me right now. Let's go ahead. Let's wrap all this up. Let's kind of give some thoughts and predictions of the event, and give us something to look forward to in the build up to the World Championship 30. So now that we kind of looked at some of the popular metagame decks and kind of maybe why they are as popular as they are, we can kind of work into some of our predictions and some storylines to think about as you kind of watch the events unfold from this weekend. So I think one of the big storylines is going to be Team Handshake versus Team CFB, which is kind of led by Simon Nielsen and Seth Manfield, the very clear 1 and 2 in the Player of the Year race. Simon Nielsen, I'm going to throw up the actual point totals and stuff up here because I actually did find them in between recordings, but we have a very clear first place leader in Simon. Seth Manfield, has the best chance of catching Simon in this, and they come from probably the two hottest teams from the last few years, and it's kind of been reminiscent of the old days where we had all these different teams and things like that, and actually team standings mattered and performance as a whole for teams mattered, and I kind of hope that we get back to that point. But definitely something to keep in mind. The player of the year race is Simon Nielsen and Seth Manfield, and it boils down even farther to the players on Team Handshake and Team CFB to kind of prepare their players on their team, but of course, they're front runners for the player of the year as best as possible and put them in the position to succeed on the weekend. Of course, we know that there's a lot of things that go into it, but the preparation is key, and these teams have done it better than absolutely anybody else, any individual person or any other team. We know Team CFB is just filled to the brim with Hall of Famers. They have numerous world championship victories, numerous worlds like top 4s, top 8s, Pro Tour top 8s, Pro Tour champions, and basically any metric that you can measure. Team CFB is one of the most decorated teams probably of all time. And I think it's very hard to find a team that you could find more knowledge and probably more experience than that team. But Team Handshake over the last few years has been very impressive. Of course, Simon Nielsen, I'm going to say, is kind of leading the charge on that team, but there's been a lot of players that we've seen in numerous Pro Tours where, Team Handshake, I think, had, 3 or 4 players or something like that on, in the top 8 of Pro Tour Lord of the Rings. And then we've even seen some of them being undefeated pretty deep into day 1 of that tournament as well, and having to play each other in, I believe, either the second to last or the final round of day 1 in that event. So, and I think Simon Nielsen also top 8'd that event as well. But, these two teams have, one has been the pillar, the upper echelon of success in Team Channel Fireball. And then you have Team Handshake, who's kind of coming into their own and have kind of been on a tear over the last few years as far as a team. And I think that this is just going to kind of culminate in this end of season thing where we're going to see Simon and Seth. We know that they both can play. We know that they are both threats to win the world championship. And by extension, Manfield could just steal away the player of the year to Simon Nielsen, or Simon can, convert as he has done for the last few years and end up being, I'm going to say, a 2-time player of the year and a serious consideration. So, this is like not only just, this singular event where we're going to crown a world champion, where we're going to have a player of the year. This is going to culminate into some players, like one of these two players, potentially just solidifying their legacy as one of the best Magic players of all time. And by extension, probably, giving Team CFB, another patch on their like very decorated vest, or Team Handshake, continuing to kind of build on their success and, potentially maybe never be considered one of the greatest teams of all time, because it's very hard to argue with, double digits and maybe even approaching triple digits of like just top 8s in major premier events. But this team just showing that, David can beat Goliath in this, and it's weird to say because Team Handshake does have some very good players, but just the fact that CFB is like the big pillar and Team Handshake is the, definitely the person coming in that has to, show their stuff, and they have definitely done that over the last few years. So I think while you have like 2 storylines in one, you have Simon versus Seth, you have Team Handshake versus Team CFB, and just to see which one can have, show the utter dominance. Because I think while CFB definitely has, I think, at least Sam Party and Seth Manfield are, in the running for the player of the year. Simon is thoroughly pacing the field, and has to have a particularly bad tournament, and Seth Manfield performed very well to actually catch up and beat Simon in this. So I think we're going to see kind of those two things taking place. And then, as I was kind of alluding to, I think both of these players, between Simon and Seth, can solidify themselves as probably one of the greatest players of all time, or at least starting to kind of creep into the conversation of it. We know that Seth Manfield has, I believe, at least one or two Pro Tours, is top 8'd, numerous other ones, is a former world champion. If he could win a second world championship, All right, he can win a second world championship. He can be a player of the year, multiple Pro Tour top eights, multiple GP top eights, all these sort of things. You start to like wonder if, if either Manfield or Simon can keep this kind of success. If either of them win the world championship, become player of the year, and then, start to kind of build on that success, Simon especially, you could definitely make the argument that, at least if Simon wins this, he ends up being probably one of the most dominant players of the last few years, full stop. While maybe only having one Pro Tour win, having one Pro Tour victory, having one World Championship, having 2 Player of the Year trophies, and then numerous Pro Tour top eights, it's hard to argue that there's any player that's been better than Simon. So I think that is going to be kind of the big things to keep an eye out for. Of course, we're going to, hear a lot about, Duskmorn Limited, because it's going to have, 6 rounds total between both days. And, Limited is just a very fun environment that like really anybody can enjoy. And I've been enjoying the little bit that I've gotten to experience of it. We have a great standard format, so we're going to be hearing all that. But I think the chatters in between, like the metagame and, the decks and the individual players maybe playing in feature matches, this is what we're going to hear. We're going to be hearing a lot about these players in the Player of the Year race that are going to be, we're going to be keeping an eye on them and their records and seeing where they're at and who's poised to make the top 8, who's maybe going to miss out, and, hopefully have a nail-biting finish, for the viewers at home, for the Player of the Year race, because I think it's going to be, it could be potentially really tight, even with Simon, I believe, having like a 9-point lead on Seth Manfield. But, I think those are the big storylines coming into this. I think one that kind of goes into the specific metagame as a whole, I think we're going to have a Gruul aggro and Golgari midrange versus the field kind of discussion. I expect these 2 decks to be the most played decks. They've seemed to be the most played decks currently as far as like metagame share. Gruul aggro more so than Golgari midrange, but they do take up, I believe, about a quarter of the metagame from the rest of the decks. I mean, like there's, they're both in about double digits metagame share, and like the other ones are hovering around like 5%. So very clearly it seems like we kind of have a 2-deck format, and then there is a few other decks that definitely have some potential to kind of dethrone those decks that have a good matchup against one, but maybe not necessarily against the other. So I think here, I think it's going to be Golgari and Gruul versus the field, but I wouldn't expect something like a domain deck, maybe built more towards beating the aggro deck, but also still trying to kind of beat up on the Golgari decks. If they expect a very high turnout of those decks, could potentially, if it runs good enough, could actually kind of take over, while I don't necessarily hold a whole lot of water, a whole lot of weight into something like that happening, because those decks also just have the chance to kind of run wild, and there's a very good chance that when you play 8 rounds of Magic against the same standard decks over and over, eventually one of them is going to kind of take a game off of you, even if you're kind of ready for it. So we'll kind of see what happens there, but I do expect there to be a lot of Gruul and a lot of Golgari, and I think that we're going to try our best to not see very many of those matchups. Probably try to see some of the more interesting ones, but I would not be surprised if we get to the top 8 and there's probably at least half the top 8 is either Gruul aggro or Golgari midrange there. So nothing too spicy, I would say, in the predictions of like what decks that we could see there, or in those storylines, and then kind of the prediction that I guess I just made there. Finally, I think the only way to wrap this up and to make it a little less long-winded, because I didn't realize how long I was talking, because that's just kind of the thing that I do. What is my prediction for the World Championship? And as I kind of talked about in the storyline portion of this, I think it's a lot of Simon Nielsen versus Seth Manfield, Team Handshake versus Team CFB. I think that the outcome of the Player of the Year race and the outcome of the World Championship, I think, is going to be between those two. And honestly, I think whatever team, breaks the format or finds the hidden deck or the right build of the right deck for the tournament is going to win. We can say that about every Pro Tour, but I think that this is especially true in standard formats. And honestly, I have a very hard time going against a player that I think will end up being one of the best players of all time, at least of the last 5 years. So my overall prediction, who is going to win World Championship 30, I have a very hard time going against Simon Nielsen. I think he's going to win the World Championship. He's going to lock up Player of the Year, and he's going to go down as probably one of the best players that we've seen in at least the last few years, and definitely be in talks, over the next few years of, could this be one of the best players of all time? Could he enter that conversation of the best players of all time? And then Seth Manfield as well. If he ends up coming in and winning the world championship, could he start to enter that conversation if he gets on a nice little run here after the next few years? Now, we don't know what the future is going to hold, but I know that right now in my gut, I kind of like, David in this David versus Goliath fight. I like Team Handshake, and I also like Simon Nielsen to win the world championship. And that is going to be my pick. I am locking it in. Simon Nielsen is going to win Player of the Year. He's going to be the world champion. And we're going to watch arguably one of the most dominant stretches of Magic that, we've seen here in recent years. And that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like the video. Comment down below what you're looking forward most to from the World Championship. Maybe if there's a certain deck that you'd like to see, a certain player do well, maybe one of the players in the World Championship. Please let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for hanging out and watching the whole video. Y'all are awesome. And we'll be back here later in the week giving a metagame breakdown of the actual meta that we plan on seeing in the event, kind of seeing what we get wrong, what we got right. And then, of course, be sure to subscribe and everything, because we are going to be doing continued coverage of Worlds throughout the week. We're going to be doing day 1, day 2, and top 8 breakdowns of the event so that y'all can get kind of a nice little synopsis of what actually happened on the day. So thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.